Welcome to the channel. In this immersive presentation, we delve into the tragic final days of Marie Antoinette. From the oppressive temple prison to the conciergeries' despair and her final, defiant moments before the guillotine, this is the comprehensive story of a queen's last stand, told in detail.
The Last Stand of Marie Antoinette, a detailed historical narrative.
Part 1. The Shadow of the Temple. The ancient, foreboding fortress of the temple stood as a stark monument to the monarchy's utter collapse, a medieval relic repurposed by the Revolution. Its grim towers now served as a cage for the remnants of a once dazzling royal family. Here, in the heart of a Paris that had once celebrated her as its Dauphine, Marie Antoinette, now officially known to the revolutionary government as the Widow Capet, endured a life stripped of all its former grandeur, a monotonous existence punctuated by fear and sorrow. The daily routine was a study in humiliation, a deliberate and constant reminder of her fall from grace. Gone were the opulent chambers of Versailles, replaced by sparsely furnished rooms under the perpetual watch of hostile guards. The once sprawling gardens where she had orchestrated pastoral fantasies were now a small, walled courtyard where her family could take short, supervised walks, their every move scrutinized by the public, who would often gather to jeer from beyond the walls. Her days were a meticulously scheduled rotation of meager meals, lessons for her son, Louis Charles, and quiet moments spent with her daughter, Marie Therese, and her sister-in-law, Madame Elizabeth. They mended their simple clothes, read from small collection of approved books, and spoke in hushed tones, ever conscious of the listening ears of their jailers. The Queen, once the arbiter of French fashion and culture, now wore a simple morning dress, a stark symbol of her widowhood, and the death of the world she had known. King Louis XVI's execution on January 21, 1793, had been a cataclysmic event, not just for France, but for the small, isolated family in the temple. It had transformed Marie Antoinette from a captive queen into the widow of a man the Republic had branded a traitor. The weight of this loss was a palpable presence in their small apartment, a constant, unspoken grief that clung to the damp stone walls. For Marie Antoinette, the loss was twofold. She mourned the husband with whom she had finally found a quiet, affectionate partnership, and she feared for the future of her children, now orphans of a deposed king. The primary focus of her existence became the well-being of her son, the boy whom royalists still recognized as King Louis XVII. She poured all her remaining energy into his education, teaching him to read and write, instilling in him the principles of the monarchy he might one day, she prayed, restore. This maternal devotion was her last remaining purpose, a reason to endure the daily degradations. The revolutionary authorities, however, saw this bond as a political threat. The boy was a living symbol of the old regime, a potential rallying point for counter-revolutionaries. The very love between mother and son was deemed a danger to the new republic, a sentiment that would have devastating consequences. The guards, chosen for their revolutionary zeal, missed no opportunity to remind the family of their captive status. They would blow smoke in the queen's face, sing revolutionary songs like the Carmagnole and Cia Ira, with menacing fervor, and scrawl graffiti on the walls of her prison, crude drawings and slogans celebrating the fall of the monarchy. Every meal was inspected, every conversation potentially reported, every moment of privacy violated. Yet, amidst the oppressive atmosphere, small acts of humanity occasionally pierced the gloom. Some guards, moved by the family's plight, or perhaps retaining a flicker of respect for the former queen, would perform small kindnesses, passing along news from the outside world or treating them with a modicum of decency. These brief respites were, however, few and far between. More common was the psychological torment inflicted by men like Jacques Hébert and Antoine Simon, radical revolutionaries who saw the royal family as the embodiment of all they sought to destroy. The spring and early summer of 1793 saw the political climate in Paris grow even more volatile. The reign of terror was beginning to tighten its grip, and the Committee of Public Safety, led by figures like Maximilien Robespierre, sought to eradicate all enemies of the revolution, both real and perceived. The former queen, imprisoned but still a potent symbol, was a natural target. The calls for her trial grew louder, fueled by radical newspapers that depicted her as a monster, a foreign conspirator, and the source of all of France's woes. For Marie Antoinette, the world had shrunk to the confines of the Temple Tower, but the shockwaves of the revolution she had helped to unwittingly unleash continued to reverberate, drawing ever closer, promising not liberation, but a final, public reckoning. The shadow of the temple was long, but the shadow of the guillotine was beginning to eclipse it. Part 2. The Widow Capet's Indictment. The summer of 1793 descended upon Paris not with warmth, but with a chilling fervor. The Committee of Public Safety, now the de facto executive government of a nation at war with itself and much of Europe, sought to consolidate its power through terror. To do so, it required sacrifice of immense symbolic value, a target whose destruction would prove the revolution's absolute and irreversible triumph. All eyes turned to the Temple Tower and its most famous prisoner, the Austrian she-wolf, the woman now known only as the Widow Capet. One Maximilian Robespierre, the austere and implacable ideologue of the Terror, demanded her trial, reminding his fellow Jacobins that she was a traitor who had passed military secrets to the enemy and could not be left unpunished. 1. The promise once made to the dying Louis XVI that his family would be spared was now a forgotten whisper, dismissed as a gratuitous horror, contrary to the Republic's new, ruthless policies. 1. The stage was being set not for a trial, but for a meticulously orchestrated political immolation. The first act of this final drama unfolded on the night of July 3rd, a moment of profound and calculated cruelty. Officials from the revolutionary government arrived at the temple with an order to separate Marie Antoinette from her son, Louis Charles. 3. The objective was twofold: to break the Queen's spirit and to place the boy, whom royalists called Louis XVII, under the guardianship of the Republic, to be re-educated as a citizen. For what ensued was a scene of raw maternal anguish. Marie Antoinette resisted with the fury of a cornered animal, physically barring the door and pleading for over an hour against the inevitable. She clung to her son, a boy of 8, who was terrified and bewildered by the intrusion. The guards threatened to use force, to kill them all if she did not comply. Eventually, exhausted and broken, she relented, dressing the child herself and delivering him to his captors with a final, desperate plea to treat him with kindness. It was a promise they had no intention of keeping. The boy was handed over to the care of a coarse, semi-literate cobbler named Antoine Simon, a man chosen for his revolutionary zeal and his lack of any paternal instinct. 2. For from her window, the Queen could sometimes catch a glimpse of her son in the courtyard, his spirit and health slowly eroding under Simon's abusive tutelage. This separation was a wound from which she would never recover. A month later, under the cover of darkness on the night of August 1st, the second act commenced. 5. Marie Antoinette was abruptly awoken and ordered to dress. She was to be transferred from the temple, which for all its misery had been a home of sorts, to the conciergerie. 6. Known as the antechamber to the guillotine, the conciergerie was a grim, medieval fortress on the banks of the Seine, the last stop for the thousands destined for the revolutionary tribunal. 7. This transfer marked her definitive reclassification from a political prisoner to a common criminal awaiting imminent judgment. 5. She was taken to a small, damp cell on the ground floor, furnished with only a bed, a small table, and a stool. A simple screen separated her from 2 gendarmes who were ordered to watch her day and night, affording her not a single moment of privacy. 6. The woman who had once commanded the opulent spaces of Versailles was now confined to a squalid dungeon, her every move under constant, hostile surveillance. 6. Meanwhile, the architect of her legal destruction, public prosecutor Antoine Quentin Fouquier-Tinville, was assembling the case against her. 9. Till cold, efficient bureaucrat of death, Fouquier-Tinville was tasked with drafting an indictment so comprehensive and damning that acquittal would be impossible. 10. 11. The document he prepared, finalized in mid-October, was not a sober list of crimes but a work of political theater, a compilation of every rumor, slander, and accusation that had been hurled at the Queen for over a decade. 12. The charges were a grotesque fusion of political treason, financial malfeasance, and personal depravity. 112. She was accused of squandering the nation's finances, of funneling millions to her brother, the Holy Roman Emperor, to wage war against France, and of masterminding a counter-revolution. 12. 13. She was blamed for the massacre of patriots on the Champ de Mars and for inciting the Swiss guards to fire on the people. 12. 14. The infamous diamond necklace affair was resurrected, despite her innocence having been established years prior. 15. But the indictment saved its most venomous charge for last, an accusation championed by the radical journalist Jacques Hébert, publisher of the vile newspaper Le Père Duchesne. 16. 17. Drawing on the coerced and manipulated testimony of her own young son, the state formally accused Marie Antoinette of incest. 2. 18. This was the final, devastating stroke, an attempt to utterly dehumanize her, to strip away her identity not just as a queen, but as a mother and a woman. 13. 19. It was a charge so monstrous that even some revolutionaries found it contemptible, with Robespierre reportedly calling Hébert a fool for inventing it. 16. But its purpose was clear, to paint the widow Capet as a monster whose very existence was a stain on the new republic, a creature whose sacrifice was necessary for the nation's purification. 6. The indictment was complete. The verdict had already been written. All that remained was the performance of the trial. Part 3. The Queen in the Conciergerie. The Conciergerie was not merely a prison. It was a wound in the heart of Paris, a festering stone labyrinth where the Republic's enemies awaited their final, bloody catharsis. A former royal palace itself, its vaulted medieval halls now echoed not with courtly music, but with the despairing cries of the condemned. When Marie Antoinette was pushed through its gates on that August night, she crossed a threshold into a different realm of suffering. The temple had been a cage. The Conciergerie was a tomb for the living. Its very air was thick with the stench of fear, damp straw, and the nearby Seine, a river that seemed to carry away the final prayers of the executed. Here, she was no longer the queen, or even the widow Capet. She was prisoner number 280, another name on a list, her identity subsumed by the inexorable machinery of the terror. Her world had shrunk to a single squalid cell, a space so meager it mocked the memory of Versailles' endless, gilded chambers. A simple canvas screen was the only barrier separating her from two National Guardsmen, whose duty was to observe her every action day and night. This constant, unblinking surveillance was a form of psychological torture more potent than any physical chains. They watched her eat her meager meals, a thin soup, a piece of bread, and they watched her sleep. They watched as she tried, with failing eyesight, to mend her worn black dress, the last vestige of her mourning for her husband. There was no privacy, no dignity, no moment of solitary reflection. The Queen of France could not even weep for her lost children without an audience. Her physical health, already fragile, began to rapidly decline in the toxic environment of the prison. She suffered from constant hemorrhages, a condition exacerbated by the dampness and stress. Her hair, which had begun to gray in the temple, now turned almost entirely white, a stark testament to her anguish. Yet, through this physical decay, a steely resolve endured. To her jailers and the few who interacted with her, she presented a mask of stoic calm, a regal composure that infuriated her enemies and astonished those who saw it. One of the few sources of humanity in this desolate place was a young servant girl named Rosalie Lamerlier, who was assigned to attend to her needs. Rosalie, in later memoirs, would remember the queen not as the arrogant monster of revolutionary propaganda, but as a polite, gentle, and profoundly sad woman. She noted how Marie Antoinette would always thank her for the small services, how she spoke softly of her children, her voice thick with a sorrow she rarely showed to her guards. Through Rosalie's eyes, prisoner number 280 was not a symbol of tyranny, but a mother grieving in the shadow of death. It was this maternal agony that defined her imprisonment. She knew nothing of her daughter Marie-Therese or her sister-in-law Elizabeth, left behind in the temple, and her thoughts were perpetually consumed by the fate of her son, Louis Charles, now in the hands of the brutal Antoine Simon. She would pace her small cell, her mind replaying their last moments together, tormented by the knowledge of his suffering. Even in this hopeless place, plots for her escape still flickered in the hearts of loyal royalists. The most famous of these was the Carnation Plot. In late August, a royalist sympathizer named Alexander gone to Rougeville managed to gain access to her cell under the guise of an inspector. He dropped a carnation at her feet, within which was concealed a small note outlining an escape plan. For a fleeting moment, hope pierced the gloom of the Conciergerie. Using a pin to prick her finger, she reportedly scrawled a reply, indicating her willingness. The plot, however, was quickly discovered through an informant. The immediate consequence was a tightening of her already suffocating security. She was moved to a different cell, one deemed even more secure, and her few remaining comforts were taken away. The failed plot served as a grim reminder that there was no escape. The walls were closing in, and the revolutionary government was leaving nothing to chance. It also provided Fouquier-Tinville with more evidence of her treasonous conspiracies, further sealing her fate. Her life became a monotonous wait, punctuated by the daily rhythms of death that surrounded her. Each morning, she heard the roll call of prisoners whose names had been called for the Revolutionary Tribunal. Each afternoon, she heard the rumble of the tumbrils in the courtyard, the crude carts that would carry her fellow prisoners to the Place de la Révolution. She heard the snipping of scissors as the executioner's assistants cut the hair from the necks of the condemned to ensure a clean cut for the blade. The conciergerie was an assembly line of death, and she was its most anticipated product. Stripped of her crown, her husband, her children, and her freedom, all that was left of Marie Antoinette was a woman of 37, waiting for her name to be called. Part 4. The Tribunal's Star Witness. On the morning of October 14, 1793, the Great Hall of the Revolutionary Tribunal was electric with anticipation. This was the moment the radical press and the Jacobin clubs had been demanding for months: the public trial of Ella Trickian, the woman they blamed for a decade of national hardship. The room was packed with spectators, a cross-section of revolutionary Paris, from the knitting women known as tricoteuses who occupied the front rows, to journalists, politicians, and the merely curious, all eager to witness the final humiliation of their former queen. The air was heavy, not just with the press of bodies, but with a palpable sense of historical gravity. The judges, presided over by the cold and methodical Marshal Herman, and the infamous public prosecutor, Antoine Quentin Fouquier-Tinville, took their seats, embodying the implacable will of the Republic. This was not to be a forum for justice, but a stage for political sacrifice, and Marie Antoinette was the designated victim. When she was led into the chamber, a hush fell over the crowd. The figure that stood before the tribunal was a ghost of the radiant monarch who had once captivated Versailles. Dressed in a simple black morning gown, her once elaborate coiffure replaced by hair that was shockingly white and cut short, she appeared frail and exhausted. Her face was pale and drawn from her long illness and imprisonment in the conciergerie. Yet, as she surveyed the hostile room, she did so with an unbowed dignity, her back straight, her gaze steady. There was no sign of the terror that must have gripped her. Instead, she projected an aura of regal composure that was in itself an act of defiance. For 2 days, she would stand and face her accusers, responding to a barrage of questions with a clarity and precision that surprised the court. She skillfully parried questions about her political influence, her expenditures, and her alleged conspiracies, her answers demonstrating a keen intellect and a deep understanding of the court politics she had once navigated. Fouquier-Tinville paraded a procession of 40 witnesses against her, a motley collection of former servants, revolutionary officials, and political opportunists. Their testimonies were a tangled web of hearsay, long-nurtured grievances, and outright falsehoods. They spoke of lavish parties, of secret correspondence with Austria, and of disdain for the French people. She was accused of orchestrating the flight to Varennes as an act of treason and of manipulating her imbecile husband to serve foreign interests. To each charge, she responded with a calm and measured denial, correcting inaccuracies and defending her actions with the logic of a monarch, not a traitor. She insisted her primary loyalty had always been to her husband and to France, the nation of her son. For hours, she withstood the onslaught, her quiet resilience a stark contrast to the venomous accusations hurled against her. But the prosecution had saved its most potent weapon for last, an attack designed not to prove treason, but to utterly annihilate her character. The radical pamphleteer Jacques Hébert, whose obscene newspaper Le Père Duchesne had long spewed vitriol against the Queen, was called to the stand. With a malevolent glee, he presented the tribunal with his masterstroke, the coerced testimony of her own son, the 8-year-old Louis Charles. Under the abusive tutelage of Antoine Simon, the boy had been plied with wine and manipulated into signing a statement accusing his mother and his aunt, Madame Elizabeth, of incestuous practices. Hébert read the grotesque charges aloud to the court, detailing how the Queen had allegedly corrupted her son, teaching him acts of debauchery. It was an accusation of such calculated monstrosity that it momentarily stunned the courtroom into silence. This was the ultimate violation, turning her maternal love, the one pure thing she had left, into a weapon against her. For the first time since the trial began, Marie Antoinette's composure shattered. She did not speak. She did not even look at Hébert, but simply lowered her head, a silent wave of revulsion and pain washing over her. Fouquier-Tinville, sensing a crack in her armor, pressed his advantage. "The citizen prosecutor observes that you have not responded to the testimony of the witness Hébert," he declared. "Why do you not answer?" A juror repeated the demand, insisting she respond to the charge. After a long, tense pause, Marie Antoinette rose to her full height. The frail prisoner vanished, and in her place stood a mother in righteous fury. Her voice, clear and ringing with emotion, cut through the silence of the hall. "If I have not replied," she declared, her eyes sweeping across the gallery. It is because nature itself refuses to respond to such a charge laid against a mother. Then she turned her gaze directly to the women in the audience, the mothers of Paris. I appeal to all mothers who may be in this room. The effect was instantaneous. A murmur of sympathy rippled through the crowd. The tricoteurses, the hard-faced women of the revolution, were visibly moved. For one brief, powerful moment, the political caricature of the Austrian she-wolf was replaced by the universal image of an outraged mother. It was a moral victory, a flash of human connection in a dehumanizing process. But it was only a moment. The judges' faces remained like stone. The verdict had been decided long before the star witness ever spoke. Part 5. A Mother's Defiance. The air in the tribunal chamber had shifted. Before Jacques Hébert's testimony, the trial had been a political affair, a dense and often tedious recitation of alleged betrayals and financial crimes. The Queen's appeal to the mothers of Paris transformed it into a primal human drama. Her cry of maternal outrage was a moment of pure, unscripted emotion that tore through the carefully constructed political narrative. For the first time, the spectators were forced to see not the monstrous effigy of l'Autrichian, but a woman, a mother, subjected to the most profane accusation imaginable. The juror who had pressed her for an answer was reportedly taken aback, mumbling that it was a personal matter. Even the hostile crowd, whipped into a frenzy by months of hateful propaganda, could not entirely suppress a wave of sympathy. It was a testament to the power of her words that they managed to momentarily silence the venom of the revolution. This brief moral victory, however, did nothing to alter the trial's predetermined course. If anything, it may have hardened the resolve of her accusers. The president of the tribunal, Marshal Herman, quickly moved to regain control, steering the proceedings back to the more familiar and less emotionally fraught territory of political conspiracy. But Marie Antoinette herself was changed by the exchange. The Hébert accusation, while devastating, seemed to have unlocked a new level of defiance within her. Having faced the most unspeakable slander, the remaining charges of treason and espionage seemed almost trivial in comparison. Her stoicism was now infused with a quiet contempt for the proceedings, the dignified bearing of someone who knew her fate was sealed but was determined to meet it on her own terms. She had defended her honor as a mother, and in doing so, had found the strength to endure the rest of the charade. The prosecution continued its parade of witnesses, but the momentum had been disrupted. Their testimony now seemed repetitive, their accusations less potent. The court heard from an army officer who claimed she had passed military plans to the Austrians, a charge she flatly denied, stating she would never betray the country of her husband and son. Former household servants were brought forward to speak of her extravagance, dredging up tales of expensive gowns and lavish festivities from a world that no longer existed. These accusations, which might have once incited outrage, now felt like echoes from a distant past, irrelevant to the grim reality of the courtroom. Marie Antoinette listened patiently, her hands resting calmly in her lap, occasionally offering a concise correction or a firm denial. She was no longer just a defendant. She had become a silent judge of her own trial, her composure a constant, implicit rebuke of its injustice. Her defense attorneys, Claude-François Chauveau-Lagarde and Guillaume-Alexandre Tronçon de Coudray, were men of courage, having accepted a case that was not only unwinnable but personally dangerous. They were severely hampered by the tribunal, given little time to prepare and no opportunity to review the prosecution's evidence beforehand. They watched with a mixture of admiration and despair as their client navigated the treacherous cross-examination. Her performance was so effective that at times she seemed to be her own best counsel. When Chauveau-Lagarde rose to offer his closing arguments, he knew he was speaking not to the court, but to history. He focused on the flimsiness of the evidence, the reliance on rumor and innuendo, and the absurdity of holding the Queen personally responsible for the political decisions of her husband's government. But it was her powerful response to Hébert's charge that formed the emotional core of his defense. He reminded the court of her appeal to the mothers of France, arguing that such a cry could only come from a place of pure innocence. He painted a picture of a devoted mother, a loyal wife, and a foreigner who had been misunderstood and maligned from the moment she set foot in France. As he spoke, Marie Antoinette maintained her quiet dignity, a living embodiment of the martyred figure her lawyer described. She knew, as did everyone in the room, that his words were falling on deaf ears. The judges were not weighing evidence, they were fulfilling a political mandate. The members of the jury, hand-picked for their revolutionary loyalty, were not impartial arbiters of fact. The trial was a ritual, and its purpose was not to discover the truth, but to ratify a decision that had already been made by the Committee of Public Safety. The Queen's defiance, her brief but stunning victory over Hébert, and her lawyer's eloquent defense were all mere footnotes in a pre-written final chapter. Yet in that courtroom, by refusing to be broken, by defending her identity as a mother with a ferocity that transcended politics, Marie Antoinette achieved a form of triumph. They could take her life, but they could not strip her of her humanity. In her final public act, she had ensured that history would have to contend not just with the caricature created by her enemies, but with the image of a mother's unyielding strength. Part 6. The Procession of Accusers. With the emotional climax of Hébert's vile testimony having passed, the trial settled into a grinding, relentless rhythm, a methodical construction of guilt, brick by sordid brick. Fouquier Tinville, having failed to break the Queen with a single monstrous blow, now resorted to a different strategy: death by 1,000 cuts. He unleashed a procession of witnesses, each adding their own small, often poisoned, contribution to the narrative of a malevolent queen. It was a carefully curated cast, drawn from every chapter of her life in France, their collective purpose to transform 2 decades of complex history into a simple, damning story of treason. The sheer volume and variety of the accusers were designed to create an overwhelming impression of guilt, burying any notion of nuance or truth under an avalanche of condemnation. This was no longer just a trial of a woman. It was the trial of an era, and she was its sole designated scapegoat. The first to be marshaled were the figures of political significance, men whose testimony was meant to cement the charge of high treason. Jean-Baptiste Drouet, the postmaster from Saint Ménehould, who had famously recognized the fleeing royal family and set in motion their capture at Varennes, took the stand. He recounted the events of that fateful night with dramatic flair, portraying the king and queen not as desperate fugitives, but as arrogant conspirators caught in the act of betraying the nation. His testimony was crucial, for the flight to Varennes was presented as the revolution's foundational proof of the monarchy's duplicity. It was the moment the king and queen ceased to be rulers and became enemies of the people. Other political figures followed, each adding details about the Austrian Committee, a supposed secret council at the Tuileries Palace where Marie Antoinette allegedly plotted with foreign powers and counter-revolutionary aristocrats. These were tales woven from suspicion and rumor, presented to the court as undeniable fact. She listened to them all, her face an impassive mask, occasionally shaking her head at a particularly egregious lie. Next came the military men, their testimony intended to stoke the fires of xenophobia and portray her as the Austrian spy. A former minister of war spoke of her constant interference in military appointments, claiming she promoted incompetent aristocrats and undermined patriotic officers. He alleged that she had passed French strategic plans to her brother, the Emperor of Austria, leading directly to French defeats on the battlefield. This was the most dangerous charge, as France was currently at war, and the idea that the former queen was an enemy agent resonated deeply with a public anxious about the threat of foreign invasion. She defended herself with a cold fury, pointing out the absurdity of the claims. "I may have been aware of the dispatch of troops," she stated with precision, "but I was never aware of their plans." She knew the difference, even if the court chose not to. She was the daughter of an empress, raised in the intricate world of European power politics. She understood the language of statecraft far better than her accusers, and this very intelligence was now being used against her as evidence of her treachery. Then came the procession of the resentful, the former servants and courtiers of Versailles. This was where the political became personal, where grand accusations of treason mingled with petty grievances. Chambermaids, valets, and minor officials, many of whom had once bowed and scraped before her, now stood in the witness box, eager to offer their pound of flesh. They spoke of her legendary extravagance, of dresses that cost fortunes, of opulent balls held while the people starved. They recounted her supposed arrogance, her preference for her small circle of favorites, and her disdain for the rigid etiquette of the French court, a disdain that was now reinterpreted as contempt for France itself. The infamous diamond necklace affair was raked up once more, with witnesses insinuating her guilt despite her name having been officially cleared years earlier. These testimonies painted a portrait of a decadent, frivolous, and out-of-touch monarch, a woman who had fiddled while Paris burned. To these charges, she offered little defense. The world they described was gone, and to argue over the cost of a dress seemed obscene in the shadow of the guillotine. She simply stated that these were the norms of her station at the time, a life she had not chosen but had been born into. Her quiet resignation in the face of these personal attacks was more powerful than any denial, suggesting the immense distance between the woman she had been and the prisoner she had become. Part 7. The Defense's Plea. The task that fell to Claude-François Chauveau-Lagarde and Guillaume-Alexandre Tronçon de Coudray was not a legal defense. It was a eulogy delivered before death, a final, futile gesture of professional honor in the face of absolute power. To stand as counsel for Marie Antoinette in the autumn of 1793 was to accept a poisoned chalice. It offered no hope of victory, only the certainty of association with a figure already condemned by the state. Yet these two men, appointed by the tribunal but acting with a genuine sense of duty, embraced the peril. They were given less than a day to prepare, handed a mountain of charges, and a list of 40 witnesses whose testimony they had not heard. Working feverishly through the night, they attempted to build a shield of logic and law against a tidal wave of revolutionary hatred, knowing all the while that it would inevitably be swept away. Their strategy was born of desperation and pragmatism. They could not defend the monarchy, nor could they challenge the legitimacy of the revolution itself. To do so would be to sign their own death warrants. Instead, they had to walk a razor's edge, to dismantle the specific accusations against the woman, while implicitly accepting the political framework that had put her in the dock. Their plea was an appeal to the distinction between Marie Antoinette the Queen, a symbol of a rejected system, and Marie Antoinette the person, a wife, a mother, and a foreigner who had been caught in the gears of history. It was a subtle argument for a court that dealt only in the brutal simplicities of patriot and traitor, but it was the only argument they had. Chauveau-Lagarde, the more prominent of the two, delivered the primary closing argument. He was a gifted orator, and he began not with a fiery rebuttal but with a somber, almost mournful tone. He implored the jury to look past the political effigy and see the frail woman before them. "Citizens," he began, his voice resonating through the tense hall, "I have a difficult task before me. I must defend the former Queen of France, but I see here only the unfortunate wife and mother." This was the crux of his defense, the deliberate humanization of his client. He methodically addressed the financial charges, arguing that her expenditures, while lavish, were consistent with the expectations of her rank under the Ancien Regime and had been approved and often encouraged by the king's ministers. He portrayed her not as the architect of the nation's bankruptcy, but as a participant in a system that the revolution itself had overthrown. He was, in effect, blaming the system to absolve the individual. On the political charges, particularly the flight to Varennes and the alleged Austrian committee, his argument was even more delicate. He presented her actions as those of a loyal wife following her husband and a concerned mother protecting her children. Could she have done otherwise, he asked the jury? Was she not bound by the will of her husband, the king? This line of reasoning cleverly used the patriarchal assumptions of the era to her advantage, framing her not as a cunning political mastermind, but as a subordinate figure acting out of familial duty. He painted a picture of a woman isolated in a foreign court, misunderstood by its complex etiquette, who naturally sought comfort in a small circle of friends, a circle now demonized as a treasonous cabal. He asked the jury to consider the immense political pressures she was under, the threats to her family, and to judge her actions not as treason, but as the desperate measures of a cornered human being. It was when he turned to the accusation of incest that his oratory reached its peak of passionate indignation. He reminded the jury of the Queen's powerful, spontaneous appeal to the mothers in the room, a moment that had transcended the political venom of the trial. He thundered that this charge, born of the foul imagination of men like Hébert, was not just an attack on the Queen, but an attack on nature itself, an insult to every family in France. He argued that this vile slander invalidated the entire prosecution, for a case that had to stoop to such depths to secure a conviction was a case with no foundation in truth. By focusing on the most depraved of the charges, he sought to cast doubt on all the others, suggesting they were all part of the same fabric of lies. Tronçon de Coudray followed with a shorter, more technical legal argument, reinforcing his colleagues' points. Together, their pleas were a masterclass in courage and legal reasoning. They had spoken into a void, offered logic to a tribunal that craved only blood, and upheld the honor of their profession in the most hopeless of circumstances. As they fell silent, a profound stillness settled over the court. The defense had made its plea. All that was left was for the executioner to render his judgment. Part 8. The Inevitable Verdict. When the voices of the defense attorneys faded into the stifling air of the tribunal hall, a profound and heavy silence descended. It was the silence of an ending, the quiet moment after the last line of a play has been spoken, before the audience dares to draw breath. For 2 days, this room had been a theater of accusation, memory, and defiance. Now all that remained was the epilogue, a conclusion that every single person in the room, from the impassive judges to the knitting tricoteurses, from the weary defense counsel to the Queen herself, knew had been written long ago. The defense's plea, for all its eloquence and courage, had been a mere formality, a final, fleeting tribute to a concept of justice that the revolution had already consumed. The president of the tribunal, Marshal Herman, broke the stillness. He began to summarize the case for the jury, but his summary was not an impartial weighing of evidence. It was a final damning indictment, a speech that stripped away the complexities and nuances presented by the defense and restated the prosecution's narrative as established fact. He spoke of a nation betrayed, of a treasury emptied by Austrian caprice, and of a virtuous people fired upon by foreign mercenaries at the Queen's command. He glossed over Marie Antoinette's powerful denials and her lawyers' logical refutations, presenting the witness testimonies, no matter how flimsy or biased, as unassailable truth. He reminded the jury of their patriotic duty, not to deliberate on guilt or innocence, but to cleanse the Republic of its most potent and venomous symbol of tyranny. His words were the oil being poured upon the embers, ensuring the fire would rage. Then Herman formally presented the 4 questions upon which the jury was to decide the fate of the widow Capet. They were framed with legalistic precision, each designed to elicit a simple, affirmative answer. First, had there existed conspiracies and communications with foreign powers and other external enemies of the Republic concerning financial aid and plans of attack and entry into French territory? Second, was Marie Antoinette of Austria, widow of Louis Capet, proven to have cooperated with these conspiracies and to have conducted these communications? Third, was there a plot to ignite civil war within the state by arming citizens against one another? Fourth, was Marie Antoinette proven to have participated in this plot? The questions were a trap. They conflated her personal actions with the broader policies of the monarchy and implied her direct agency in every alleged conspiracy, leaving no room for a verdict other than guilty. The 12 jurors filed out. Their deliberation was a formality of breathtaking brevity. There was no heated debate, no weighing of conflicting testimony. They were in agreement before the door had even closed behind them. In the courtroom, the minutes stretched into an eternity. The spectators shifted in their seats, their whispers dying down into a collective, tense anticipation. Lamplight cast long, dancing shadows across the hall, illuminating the grim faces of the judges and the pale, exhausted features of Chauveau-Lagarde and Tronçon de Coudray, who sat with their heads bowed, the weight of their failure pressing down on them. Through it all, Marie Antoinette sat motionless, her gaze fixed on some indeterminate point in the distance. She seemed to have retreated into some final, inner fortress of the self, a place the court could not touch. When the jury returned after less than an hour, a single scrape of a bench sounded like a thunderclap in the charged silence. The foreman stood, his face set like stone. He held a piece of paper from which he read their findings. To the first question, on the existence of conspiracies with the enemy, the answer was yes. To the second question, on the participation of Marie Antoinette, the answer was yes. To the third question, on the plot to ignite civil war, the answer was yes. To the fourth question, on the participation of Marie Antoinette, the answer was yes. A unanimous verdict of guilty on all counts. A collective intake of breath swept the room, followed by a smattering of applause that quickly grew into a roar of approval. Fouquier Tinville then rose and, with cold satisfaction, demanded the penalty stipulated by the law: death. Herman turned his gaze to the prisoner. Marie Antoinette did not flinch. She did not cry out. She did not faint. As the sentence of death by guillotine was formally pronounced, she showed no reaction at all. Her face remained a mask of regal indifference. The verdict, so shocking in its finality, was to her no surprise. It was merely the confirmation of an ending she had been anticipating for years. Her composure was her final, silent act of defiance. Without a glance at the judges, the jury, or the jeering crowd, she rose and allowed the guards to lead her from the courtroom, her back straight, her head held high, walking toward the last sunrise she would ever see. Part 9. A Final Letter. led from a cacophony of the tribunal back into the tomb-like silence of the conciergerie. Marie Antoinette was a study in spectral calm. The jeers and cheers of the crowd faded behind her, replaced by the familiar damp chill and the rhythmic drip of water somewhere in the stone corridors. The guards who escorted her, men who had watched her for weeks, now did so with a kind of nervous awe. They had witnessed her composure under a fusillade of hatred, and it had unnerved them. She was no longer just prisoner number 280. She was a woman who had looked death in the face and had not blinked. Back in her cell, the meager reality of her existence rushed back in. The rough bed, the single stool, the ever-present screen behind which her jailers stood their watch. The sentence had been passed. Her life was no longer measured in days or weeks, but in a handful of hours. A constitutional priest, Abbé Antoine Girard, was sent to her by the tribunal. He was a juring priest, one who had sworn an oath of allegiance to the revolutionary government's civil constitution of the clergy, a document that had subordinated the church to the state and which the Pope had condemned. For Marie Antoinette, a devout and traditional Catholic, such a priest was an apostate, a functionary of the very regime that had murdered her husband and was about to murder her. She received him politely, as was her nature, but when he offered to hear her confession and give her absolution, she refused him with a quiet but unbreakable firmness. "I am about to die," she explained, "but I will not receive the sacrament from a priest who has sworn an oath I do not recognize." It was her final act of spiritual rebellion. She would face God on her own terms, her conscience clear, her faith uncompromised by the revolution that had taken everything else. She would die loyal to her king, her family, and her church. Having secured her spiritual solitude, one final, urgent need consumed her. To speak one last time to those she loved, she requested a pen, ink, and paper. In a small act of mercy, or perhaps out of a grudging respect, her request was granted. In the flickering candlelight of her cell, at around 4 o'clock in the morning, with the sounds of Paris slumbering before its day of bloody spectacle, Marie Antoinette sat down to write. Her hands were steady. The letter was addressed to her sister-in-law, Madame Elizabeth, the woman who had been her steadfast companion through the long years of captivity, a second mother to her children. But the letter was intended for a wider audience. It was her testament, her final words to her children, to France, and to history. She began by speaking of her sentence, not with anger, but with a profound sense of peace. "It is to you, my sister, that I write for the last time," she wrote. She explained that she had been condemned not to a shameful death, which was only for criminals, but to rejoin her husband, Louis XVI. In this, she found solace, professing her innocence with the same conviction as he had. Her thoughts then turned to the most painful subject, forgiveness. In a passage of extraordinary grace, she pardoned all her enemies for the wrongs they had done her. She asked God to forgive them, echoing the final sentiments of her husband. It was a staggering act of Christian charity from a woman who had been so relentlessly persecuted. Her most poignant words were for her children. She pleaded with her daughter, Marie-Therese, to care for her younger brother, to be his comfort and guide. And in a command that spoke to her deep fear of a legacy of hatred, she implored them both, but especially her son, Louis Charles, never to seek revenge for their parents' deaths. "Let him remember," she wrote, "that he must not avenge our deaths." It was a plea to break the cycle of vengeance that was drowning France in blood. She spoke of her husband, defending his memory and his profound goodness. She expressed her deep regret for any pain she might have unintentionally caused him throughout their lives together. She affirmed her unwavering Catholic faith, which had been her anchor in the storm, expressing sorrow only that she could not receive the last sacraments from a faithful, non-juring priest before her death. Finally, she addressed Elizabeth directly, thanking her for her unwavering friendship, her sacrifice, and her love. She ended the letter with a farewell to all her friends and family, asking for their forgiveness for any grief she had caused. "Adieu, adieu. I am going to occupy myself only with my spiritual duties," she concluded. Having poured her entire soul onto the pages, she folded the letter. She did not weep. The act of writing had been a final unburdening, a way of setting her earthly accounts in order. She kissed the letter, a final, desperate caress meant for her children and sister. But the letter would never reach them. It was intercepted by Fouquier Tinville and filed away, a piece of evidence in a closed case. Madame Elizabeth would go to her own death months later without ever knowing of this final message of love and forgiveness. The Queen's testament, her final act of maternal love, became a state secret, lost for decades. Having finished, she lay down on her bed, fully clothed, to rest, her conscience clear, her goodbyes said, awaiting the dawn and the executioner. Part 10. The Last Sunrise. The first light of dawn on October 16, 1793, was a pale, indifferent gray, filtering through the high, barred window of the conciergerie and doing little to dispel the gloom of the cell. It was the last sunrise Marie Antoinette would ever see, and it illuminated a world that had become brutally simple. The city of Paris was beginning to stir, the distant clatter of market carts and the murmur of a waking metropolis seeping through the stone walls. For the woman within, these were the sounds of a life that was no longer hers, a world that would continue without her. She had not slept, but had lain in a state of calm repose, a profound stillness that came after the finality of the verdict and the emotional catharsis of her final letter. Her accounts with God and her family were settled. All that was left was the final, physical ordeal. Shortly after dawn, the sounds of officialdom broke the quiet. The heavy tread of boots, the jangle of keys, the unbarring of her cell door. The men who entered were not the usual guards. At their head was Charles-Henri Sanson, the public executioner of Paris. A tall, imposing figure, Sanson was a professional, a man who performed his grim duty with a practiced, almost clinical detachment. He was not there to taunt or to judge, but to prepare the condemned for the blade. With him was his assistant, who carried a large pair of shears. This was the first step in the ritual of public execution, a process designed to strip away the last vestiges of individual identity and transform the prisoner into an object for public consumption. Marie Antoinette was instructed to sit. She did so without protest. The assistant gathered her thin, white hair in his hands. The sharp, metallic snip of the shears was a shockingly intimate sound in the quiet cell. Lock by lock, the hair that had once been the canvas for the most extravagant styles in Europe, piled high with powder, ribbons, and jewels, fell to the dirty floor. The cut was rough and practical, designed for one purpose only, to clear the back of the neck so the guillotine's blade would have an unimpeded path. It was a profound act of humiliation, a shearing of her past, her royalty, and her femininity. When it was done, she was left with a ragged, shorn crop that exposed the nape of her neck, marking her as ready for the scaffold. Next came the matter of her dress. She had been wearing the same black morning gown for weeks, a garment now tattered and stained. Sanson informed her she could not be executed in black. She would be given a new garment. The servant girl, Rosalie Lamerlier, brought her a simple chemise of plain white cotton. The choice of white was deeply symbolic. For the revolutionaries, it was the plain garment of a common condemned woman. For Marie Antoinette and her sympathizers, it was the color of innocence and martyrdom, the color worn by royal brides. As she changed, she turned her back to the guards, a final, futile assertion of modesty in a place that had afforded her none. The flimsy white dress did little to ward off the damp chill of the cell, leaving her looking frail and vulnerable, a stark white figure against the gray stone. The final indignity was the binding of her hands. Sanson approached with a length of thick cord. He instructed her to place her hands behind her back. For a moment, she resisted, a flicker of the old regal pride asserting itself. To be bound like a common thief was an insult she found hard to bear. But resistance was pointless. Sanson, with a brusqueness born of routine, insisted, and she relented. He pulled the cords tight, cinching her wrists together behind her back, forcing her shoulders into an unnatural, submissive posture. This was the ultimate physical manifestation of her helplessness. She could no longer gesture, no longer defend herself, no longer even wipe a tear from her eye. She was now completely at the mercy of her captors, a package ready for delivery. Her transformation was complete. The queen was gone. The widow was gone. All that remained was condemned prisoner number 280, shorn, bound, and waiting for the tumbril whose heavy wheels she could now hear rumbling in the courtyard outside. Part 11. The Tumbril to Oblivion. The journey from the conciergerie to the Place de la Révolution was not long in distance, barely more than a mile, but it was a journey across an ocean of human hatred. When Marie Antoinette was led from the shadowy confines of the prison into the bright, chaotic daylight of the courtyard, the full force of revolutionary Paris fell upon her. Unlike her husband, who had been granted the small dignity of a closed carriage, the Committee of Public Safety had decreed that the former queen would be taken to her death in a tumbril. This was the common cart of the condemned, a crude, open-backed wagon with two wheels, drawn by a single horse. It was an instrument of public shame, designed to expose its occupant to the full fury of the crowd. As she was jostled onto the rough wooden planks, her hands bound tightly behind her, she was no longer a distant, symbolic enemy. She was a target, vulnerable and exposed. The tumbril lurched forward, its iron-rimmed wheels grinding against the cobblestones, and plunged into the throng. The streets were a living sea of people, a dense mass of humanity that had come out for the spectacle. They packed the roadways, hung from windows, and clung to lampposts, their faces a churning tableau of curiosity, triumph, and raw, visceral loathing. The air was thick with the stench of unwashed bodies, cheap wine, and roasting chestnuts, a smell she would have once found impossibly vulgar. Now it was the scent of her own death. A priest, the same Abbé Gerard she had refused, sat opposite her in the cart, reciting prayers she refused to acknowledge. Her focus was entirely on the ordeal at hand, on maintaining her composure in this final, terrifying gauntlet. The noise was a physical assault. It rose from the crowd in waves, a deafening roar composed of 1,000 individual insults, threats, and jeers. "Lautrichian," they screamed the old xenophobic slur. "Veto," they cried, blaming her for obstructing the people's will. They called her Madame Deficit, holding her personally responsible for the nation's bankruptcy. They mocked her shorn hair and her plain white dress, contrasting it with the legendary opulence of Versailles. Women held up their children to get a better look at the she-wolf, teaching them to hate a woman they had never met. The sound was relentless, a psychological battery designed to break her spirit before the blade ever fell. But Marie Antoinette refused to give them the satisfaction. Seated on a wooden plank, her back ramrod straight despite the painful binding of her hands, she stared ahead, her gaze fixed over the heads of the crowd. Her face was a mask of pale, aristocratic contempt. She would not engage. She would not look at them. She would deny them her fear. The procession moved at a walking pace, deliberately slow, to prolong the spectacle. It snaked its way along the Rue Saint-Honoré, the main artery of revolutionary Paris, a street lined with shops and cafes that were now crammed with spectators. At one point, the cart passed by the house where Robespierre was staying. He was said to have watched from a window, a cold, unseen observer of his triumph. As the tumbril passed the church of Saint Roch, it was met with a particularly vicious volley of insults from a crowd of Jacobin sympathizers. But it was also here that a moment of unexpected artistry occurred. The great neoclassical painter Jacques-Louis David, the Revolution's official artist, sat on a terrace, sketchbook in hand. With a few swift, cruel strokes, he captured her image in the cart. His sketch is a brutal masterpiece of propaganda. It shows a haggard, defiant old woman, her jaw set, her lower lip protruding in a Habsburg pout of supposed arrogance. It is not a portrait but a caricature, an image of the monster the Revolution needed her to be. It is the last image of her drawn from life, a final, pitiless verdict rendered in ink. For over an hour, she endured this slow-motion crucifixion. The jolting of the cart was a constant, jarring torment, yet her posture never wavered. Her pale face, exposed to the October chill, betrayed no emotion. It was perhaps the most remarkable performance of her life, an act of sheer willpower in the face of unimaginable pressure. She was creating her own counter-narrative, one not of a cowering criminal, but of a queen facing her end with a dignity her tormentors could not comprehend. As the tumbril finally rumbled out of a narrow street and into the vast, open expanse of the Place de la Révolution, she raised her eyes. In the center of the square, silhouetted against the gray sky, stood her final destination. It was the guillotine, its tall wooden frame and gleaming, angled blade waiting to welcome her. The roar of the crowd intensified, a final, triumphant crescendo. The journey was over. Part 12, the Place de la Révolution. The Place de la Révolution was a vast, open wound in the heart of Paris, a grand square deliberately repurposed for the ritual of political bloodletting. Once known as the Place Louis XV, it had been designed to celebrate the glory of the French monarchy, centered around a magnificent equestrian statue of the king. Now the statue was gone, torn down and melted into cannonballs, and in its place stood a new, more terrible monument, the guillotine. As the tumbril made its slow, final turn into this enormous space, the roar of the crowd exploded, no longer channeled by narrow streets, but amplified by the sheer scale of the arena. Tens of thousands of citizens had gathered, a human carpet stretching from the entrance of the Tuileries Gardens to the banks of the Seine. This was the epicenter of the terror, the great stage where the Republic performed its daily act of violent self-definition, and today's performance was its most anticipated. For Marie Antoinette, the sight must have been overwhelming. Before her stood the colossal machine that had taken her husband's life 9 months earlier. Its raw wooden beams formed a stark silhouette against the overcast sky, the angled blade at its peak glinting with a cold, hungry light. The platform was surrounded by a sea of upturned faces, a terrifying mosaic of hatred, morbid curiosity, and revolutionary fervor. To her right lay the Tuileries Gardens, their formal, manicured beauty, a ghostly reminder of the world she had lost. Behind those trees stood the Tuileries Palace itself, the place where she had reigned as Queen of France and later endured her first imprisonment with her family. Now, she looked upon it from a vantage point of her own executioner. The cruel circularity of her fate was laid bare in this final, panoramic view of her life and death. The tumbril jolted to a halt at the foot of the scaffold. The journey was over. Charles-Henri Sanson and his assistants moved with a grim efficiency. They let down the cart's tailgate and motioned for her to dismount. Her hands were still bound tightly behind her, and her body was stiff and weak. As she navigated the awkward step down, she stumbled, accidentally treading on the executioner's foot. Her reaction was instantaneous, a reflex drilled into her by a lifetime of courtly etiquette. "Monsieur," she said, her voice clear and steady, "je vous demande pardon, je n'ai pas fait exprès." "Sir, I ask your pardon. I did not do it on purpose." The words were so incongruous, so profoundly out of place amidst the brutality of the scene, that they stunned Sanson for a moment. It was the Queen, emerging for one final, ghostly flicker, a woman apologizing for a minor social infraction on the very threshold of her own death. This small, unscripted moment would become one of the most enduring legends of her execution, a perfect encapsulation of her unshakable composure. She was then guided or pushed up the short, steep flight of wooden steps to the platform. The crowd fell into a hushed, expectant silence. Every eye was fixed on the small, white-clad figure now standing beside the deadly machine. For a few brief seconds, she was alone with her thoughts, granted a final view of her lost kingdom. What she thought in that moment no one can know. Did she think of her children, imprisoned and alone in the temple tower? Of her husband, whose fate she was about to share? Or did she simply steel herself for the final impact? The assistants did not give her long to contemplate. They quickly seized her, pushing her forward toward the bascule, the plank that would tip her horizontally into position. She did not struggle. Her defiance was now entirely internal, a silent refusal to grant her executioners the satisfaction of her fear. They strapped her to the plank and pushed it forward. Her neck was now locked into the lunette, the crescent-shaped wooden collar at the base of a guillotine. Her last sensation would have been the rough, splintery wood against her skin and the cold autumn air on her exposed neck. Her last sight would have been a bucket filled with sawdust placed directly below to catch the blood. Above her, Sanson checked the mechanism one last time. He then moved to the side of the machine and grasped the rope that held the weighted blade in place. For a fraction of a second, time stood still. The entire square held its breath. The executioner pulled the release. There was a sharp clicking sound, a high-pitched whir as the 60-pound blade slid down its grooves with terrifying speed, and then a heavy, sickening thud. At precisely 12:15 in the afternoon, the life of Marie Antoinette, the last Queen of France, was over. The silence was broken as Sanson's youngest assistant reached into the basket, pulled out the severed head by its shorn, white hair, and held it aloft for the crowd to see. A single massive roar of "Vive la République" erupted from 10,000 throats, a sound of brutal, cathartic triumph that echoed across the vast and blood-soaked square. Part 13. The Fall of the Blade. The head of the widow Capet, held aloft by the executioner's assistant, was the bloody punctuation mark at the end of a long and venomous sentence. For a moment, the vast crowd in the Place de la Révolution was united in a single, guttural roar of "Vive la République." It was a sound of triumph, of release, of a terrible catharsis achieved. They had brought the Austrian she-wolf to heel, and her death felt like a victory against all the forces of tyranny and foreign intrigue that had haunted the revolutionary imagination for years. The spectacle they had craved was complete, and the initial reaction was one of ferocious, unadulterated joy. This was the people's justice, brutal and swift, performed in the open air for all to see, a definitive severing of the past from the present. But as the initial wave of exultation crested and began to recede, a different, more ghoulish atmosphere settled over the square. The execution became less a political act and more a public relic. A morbid carnival of death unfolded at the foot of the scaffold. Those closest to the platform pushed forward, eager for a souvenir of the historic moment. Men dipped the tips of their pikes into the growing pool of blood at the base of the guillotine. Others produced handkerchiefs, scraps of paper, or pieces of cloth to soak up the Queen's blood, creating grisly mementos of the day. The executioner, Sanson, and his men worked to clean the machine, their movements practiced and indifferent, while below them a macabre scramble for relics took place. The body of the Queen, a headless trunk still clad in its simple white chemise, was unstrapped from the bascule and unceremoniously bundled into a rough wooden coffin that lay waiting. The journey to the grave was a stark and silent inversion of the procession to the scaffold. There was no jeering crowd following this cart, only a few officials and the quiet rumble of wheels. The coffin containing her body and the separate basket holding her head were taken to the Madeleine Cemetery, a grim plot of land that had become one of the main repositories for the guillotine's victims. It was not a place of peaceful repose, but a repository of the Revolution's dead, including the Swiss guards who had died defending her, and, more recently, her own husband, Louis XVI. There was to be no royal tomb, no marble effigy, no inscription to mark her final resting place. The coffin was lowered into a deep, common grave, a pit already occupied by other headless victims of the terror. To hasten decomposition, and more importantly, to prevent royalist sympathizers from ever recovering the remains to create a martyr shrine, buckets of quicklime were poured over the coffin. The corrosive substance would consume the flesh and bone, erasing the physical last traces of the Queen from the earth. It was the final, posthumous act of desecration, an attempt not just to kill the woman, but to annihilate her very body from history. Back in the offices of the Revolutionary Tribunal, the final piece of paperwork was completed. The state's machinery, having processed her through its legal and punitive stages, now finalized its records. An official death certificate was drawn up for Marie Antoinette Lorraine d'Autriche, identified as the 38-year-old widow of Louis Capet. The cause of death was stated with bureaucratic coldness. The document was a testament to the Revolution's attempt to strip her of all royal identity, reducing her to a name on a list, a file to be closed. The Queen of France had been officially erased, replaced by a female citizen executed for crimes against the state. The letter she had written to her sister-in-law, her final testament of love and forgiveness, was confiscated by Fouquier Tinville, who saw it not as a personal document, but as potential political propaganda. It was filed away with the other evidence from the trial, its heartfelt pleas silenced by the state, destined not to be read by her family, for whom it was intended. The Republic had not only taken her life and her body, it had taken her final words as well, ensuring that her obliteration was as total and complete as it could possibly make it. Part 14. The Aftermath and the Children's Fate. With the Queen's head in a basket and her body dissolving in quicklime, the revolutionary government might have believed it had cauterized the wound of the monarchy. But in the cold, silent rooms of the Temple Tower, 3 living remnants of that monarchy remained, their fates now hanging by the most slender of threads. The execution of Marie Antoinette did not end the story. It merely transferred the full weight of the revolution's wrath onto those she had left behind. For her daughter, Marie Therese, her son, Louis Charles, and her sister-in-law, Madame Elizabeth, the Queen's death was not a conclusion, but the beginning of the final act of their own personal tragedies, a slow, grinding ordeal of grief, isolation, and systematic cruelty that would, for some, prove even more terrible than the swift finality of the guillotine. Madame Elizabeth, the deeply pious and gentle sister of Louis XVI, now found herself the sole guardian of the 2 royal orphans. She had been a bedrock of faith and stability for the family throughout their imprisonment, and she did her utmost to shield the children from the horror of their situation. She did not know for certain that Marie Antoinette was dead, though she surely suspected it after the Queen was transferred to the conciergerie. She continued to care for Marie Therese, sharing a room with her, offering comfort, and leading her in prayer. But her saintly reputation offered no protection from the terror's insatiable appetite. In May 1794, during the height of Robespierre's power, her own name was called. She was taken to the conciergerie and subjected to a sham trial. Accused of aiding the king's flight, and corresponding with enemies of the state, she was condemned to death with virtually no defense. On the tumbril, her serene composure and prayers gave comfort to the other condemned prisoners traveling with her. Her execution was a particularly senseless act of cruelty, the murder of a woman whose life had been dedicated entirely to charity and faith. Her death left the two children utterly alone in the temple, orphans in the truest sense of the word. The ordeal of Marie-Thérèse, the orphan of the temple, was one of profound psychological torment. After her aunt's execution, she was plunged into total solitary confinement. She was just 16 years old. For over a year, she lived in a locked room, seeing no one but the guards who brought her meager food. She had no books, no news, and no human contact. She spent her days scrubbing the floors, mending her clothes, and pacing the small space, her mind a prison of grief and uncertainty. She did not know what had become of her mother, her aunt, or her brother, whose agonizing cries she could sometimes hear through the thick walls. It was an existence designed to break the spirit, a deliberate campaign of psychological warfare against a teenage girl. Her survival was a testament to an iron will inherited from her mother. Only after the fall of Robespierre and the end of the Terror in late 1794 was her captivity eased slightly. In 1795, on her 17th birthday, she was finally released, traded to her Austrian cousins in exchange for several French Republican prisoners. She would be the only member of the immediate family to survive the revolution, a living repository of its deepest traumas. The fate of her younger brother Louis Charles, the boy once known as the Dauphin and whom royalists considered King Louis XVII, is the most heartbreaking chapter of the saga. After being torn from his mother in July 1793, he was placed under the care of the brutish cobbler Antoine Simon and his wife. Their task was to re-educate the boy, to strip him of his royal identity, and turn him into a good Republican citizen. Their methods were psychological torture and physical abuse. They forced him to drink alcohol, taught him to sing revolutionary songs and curse his own family, and beat him. After the Hebridists were purged, Simon was removed, but the boy's situation grew catastrophically worse. From mid-1794, he was locked away in a dark, sealed room in the temple. He was left in total isolation, wallowing in his own filth, without light or human contact. When guards finally entered the room after many months, they found a terrified, emaciated child, covered in sores and unable to speak, his joints swollen with what was likely tuberculosis. Doctors were called, but was too late. On June 8, 1795, at the age of 10, the boy who would have been king died in his prison cell, a victim of the most profound neglect and cruelty. His death, however, was so shrouded in secrecy that it immediately gave rise to persistent rumors that he had been swapped for another child and had escaped, fueling the rise of dozens of pretenders for decades to come. The little boy in the temple had become a martyr, his slow, agonizing death a far deeper stain on the Republic's honor than the clean slice of the guillotine that had killed his parents. Part 15. The Myth of the Martyred Queen. The fall of the blade was not an end, but a genesis. In the instant of her death, Marie Antoinette the woman ceased to exist, and Marie Antoinette the symbol was born, a figure destined to be perpetually contested and reinvented. The revolution had executed a traitor, the widow Capet, in a public display of punitive justice. But the manner of her death, the quiet dignity, the shorn hair, the final apology to her executioner, provided the raw material for a powerful counter-narrative. For the enemies of the revolution, both within France and across the royal courts of Europe, she was not a traitor but a martyr, a queen sacrificed on the bloody altar of a godless republic. Her execution, intended to symbolize the absolute end of the old world, instead became the foundational text for the myth of royal martyrdom, a story that would prove just as potent as any revolutionary tract. This transformation was cemented 2 decades later with the fall of Napoleon and the Bourbon Restoration, when Louis XVI's brother ascended the throne as Louis XVIII in 1814. The new regime faced a crisis of legitimacy. To restore the monarchy's sacred aura, it needed to heal the wounds of the regicide. This required a public and theatrical act of atonement. One of the new king's first orders was to locate and retrieve the remains of his brother and sister-in-law from their ignominious graves in the Madeleine Cemetery. In January 1815, after a grim search through the soil saturated with quicklime and the remains of hundreds of victims, 2 coffins were exhumed. The remains were fragmented, but officials claimed to identify them based on the location described by witnesses and the discovery of remnants, including what was said to be one of the Queen's garters. The recovered bones were placed in lead caskets and taken in a solemn, torch-lit procession across Paris to the Basilica of Saint Denis, the ancient necropolis of French kings. There they were reinterred with all the pomp and religious ceremony the old monarchy could muster. The woman the Republic had tried to erase was now officially reconsecrated as a queen and a martyr. To further solidify this narrative, Louis XVIII commissioned the construction of the Chapelle Expiatoire, the expiatory chapel, on the very ground of the former Madeleine Cemetery. This neoclassical monument, completed in 1826, was not a celebration but a somber apology, a stone and marble expression of national guilt. Inside, two statues dominate the space. One depicts Louis XVI being comforted by an angel, the other shows Marie Antoinette kneeling, supported by a figure representing religion. Inscribed on the pedestal of her statue are the words of her final, undelivered letter to Madame Elizabeth, her testament of forgiveness now transformed into a sacred public text. The chapel was a political statement, an attempt to literally pave over the memory of the Revolution with a monument to its most famous victims, transforming a chaotic burial ground into a site of royalist pilgrimage. Throughout the 19th century, her image continued to evolve, colored by the Romantic movement's fascination with tragic heroines and fallen royalty. Historians and writers, from Alphonse de Lamartine to Stefan Zweig a century later, shifted the focus from her alleged political crimes to her personal suffering. She became the tragic queen, the devoted mother, the beautiful victim of a cruel fate. Her youthful frivolity at Versailles was reinterpreted not as moral failure, but as the understandable naivety of a young girl unprepared for her role. Her ordeal in the Temple and her stoic courage on the scaffold became the defining features of her story. This romanticized portrayal often glossed over her political miscalculations and her resistance to reform, preferring the more emotionally resonant image of a woman of sorrow. It was in this soil that the modern, sympathetic view of Marie Antoinette took root, a stark contrast to the monstrous caricature drawn by Jacques-Louis David. Even as the image of the martyr grew, the most famous slander against her not only survived but flourished. The phrase, "let them eat cake," or "tu es mangent de la brioche," became irrevocably attached to her name. The phrase almost certainly never crossed her lips. Variations of the callous anecdote had been attributed to other royal figures in writings that predated her arrival in France. It was a piece of free-floating propaganda that perfectly encapsulated the perceived gulf between the starving masses and a decadent, out-of-touch aristocracy. The line stuck to Marie Antoinette because it fit the caricature her enemies had created. Its persistence, even in the face of historical evidence to the contrary, demonstrates the enduring power of political myth. She remains simultaneously a symbol of martyrdom and a symbol of oblivious arrogance, a contradiction that lies at the heart of her legacy. Today, Marie Antoinette is neither the demon of the Revolution nor the saint of the Restoration. She has become a figure of intense historical and cultural fascination, a canvas for exploring themes of celebrity, power, gender, and political upheaval. Modern biographies and films have sought to uncover the woman behind the myths, portraying a complex and flawed individual caught in the cross-currents of history. She was a foreign princess who never fully understood the country she was meant to rule, a queen whose attempts to influence politics were often clumsy and disastrous, but also a devoted mother and a woman who, when stripped of everything, found a core of inner strength that allowed her to face her annihilation with extraordinary grace. The final truth of her character is lost, buried under layers of slander and hagiography. What remains is the myth, or rather the myths, powerful, contradictory, and as captivating today as the roar of the crowd that greeted the fall of the blade. Thank you for joining us on this harrowing journey. Marie Antoinette's story, transforming from a vilified queen to a symbol of martyrdom, continues to fascinate and horrify. If you found this narrative compelling, please like and subscribe, and share your thoughts on these historic events in the comments below.